It started with a single notice taped to the front door. Bright red, bold letters screaming, "VOA Tyone." But what the HOA claimed my pregnant ex had done wrong was so absurd, it felt like a setup. Within days, fines piled up, neighbors whispered, and board members acted like they owned every inch of her life. Even the space inside her own home. She was exhausted, stressed, and 8 months pregnant, and they just kept pushing. What the HOA didn't know was that they'd crossed a line they could never come back from. And someone was about to make them pay for it. Before everything spiraled out of control, life in Maplewood Estates looked picture perfect from the outside. Neatly trimmed lawns, rows of identical mailboxes, families waving at each other during morning walks. It was the kind of neighborhood that prided itself on order, the kind enforced by an HOA that seemed to believe uniformity was the same thing as peace. My ex Emily had moved there a year after we split up. We stayed on decent terms, mostly because she was expecting our child and needed support. The house she found was small but cozy, a place she hoped to make her own before the baby arrived. It was her first time living alone, and she was determined to do things right, pay her dues, follow the rules, stay out of trouble. At first, everything seemed fine. The neighbors smiled, the HOA board sent her a welcome packet, and life felt stable again. She kept to herself mostly. Morning walks around the lake, evenings on the porch with a cup of tea, the kind of quiet that helped her breathe again after a messy breakup. But in a place like Maplewood, peace doesn't last long when someone decides you don't belong. The trouble started small. A board member named Carol, the HOA president, seemed to take a strange interest in Emily. She'd drop by, unannounced, pretending to check on landscaping or paint compliance, but always with that same thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Emily brushed it off at first. Maybe Carol was just overly involved, like so many HOA volunteers are. But then came the notes. Little yellow slips tucked into her mailbox. Vague warnings about property appearance and neighborhood standards. One morning, she found a printed notice taped to her garage door, claiming her trash cans were visible from the street. The cans were hidden behind a fence. Still, the letter threatened a fine if she didn't correct the issue. When she called me about it, her voice shook between frustration and disbelief. It seemed ridiculous. A misunderstanding. Maybe, but I could tell it was getting under her skin. Stress and pregnancy don't mix well, and Maplewood's perfect lawns started to feel more like prison walls. A week later, she planted a few potted flowers by the front porch. She'd mentioned wanting to make the place feel alive. The next day, another violation notice appeared, this time for unapproved exterior modifications. The flowers. The HOA actually fined her for planting flowers. That was the first time I felt something dark creeping into this picture perfect neighborhood. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control. Someone on that board, probably Carol, had decided to make Emily a target. But what they didn't realize was that Emily wasn't alone. I might not have lived there, but I wasn't going to sit back and watch her get pushed around, not while she was carrying our child. Still, I told her to stay calm. Don't give them a reason to escalate. Pay the small fines if she had to, keep her head down, and focus on the baby. Maybe they'd lose interest. They didn't. Soon, she started getting violation letters for things that made no sense. Curtains not neutral enough. Driveway needs resurfacing. Mailbox leaning slightly forward. Every week brought a new accusation. A new fee. The fines stacked up faster than she could keep track, and every time she tried to appeal, The board denied her requests without explanation. Neighbors began to avoid her. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Rumors spread. Whispers that she was trouble. That she didn't respect the rules. It was isolation disguised as community order. The final straw came one evening when she found a board member taking photos of her backyard through the slats of the fence. When she confronted them, they claimed it was for property verification. That's when I knew this wasn't just harassment. It was personal. Maplewood Estates looked peaceful from the outside, but behind the manicured hedges and friendly newsletters, it was rotting with petty power. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. It was feeding on control, on fear, on people too exhausted to fight back. And as Emily's due date got closer, the HOA's harassment got bolder. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted to break her. But they picked the wrong person to mess with. Because when the final notice came, threatening to take legal action over a made-up violation, I decided it was time to stop playing nice. They wanted a fight. And this time, they were going to get one. The first time I realized how deep the HOA's control ran was when Emily called me in tears. She had just come home from a doctor's appointment to find a bright orange tag hanging on her front door. Immediate compliance required. The notice claimed her lawn was overgrown and unkempt. I drove over that evening, expecting to find knee-high weeds or something genuinely out of hand. But when I got there, the grass was barely a quarter-inch longer than her neighbor's. Perfectly green. Perfectly fine. Yet there it was, a 150 fine. That was the day I stopped believing this was a misunderstanding. Every week brought something new. A parking violation for her car being 2 inches over the painted line. A noise complaint for her wind chimes. Even a warning for leaving a baby stroller on the porch, which they called unsightly clutter. The rules didn't just tighten, they twisted. It wasn't about property anymore. It was about control. And they were using Emily's pregnancy, her exhaustion, her vulnerability, as leverage. The board met twice a month, and somehow, every new rule seemed designed to make her life harder. The fines stacked so fast, it was impossible to keep up. Over first 200 in just 2 months. And every appeal she filed was denied without explanation. At night, she started hearing footsteps outside. Shadows near the fence line. The porch light would flicker, and she swore someone was watching her windows. When she told the HOA about it, they said she was creating unnecessary disturbance, and threatened another fine for false reports. That's when I decided to get involved directly. I went with her to the next board meeting. The community hall looked like something out of a bad TV drama. A long folding table up front, 5 people sitting like judges, and a handful of homeowners staring down at their phones, pretending not to care. Carol, the HOA president, sat in the middle. Her smile was as polished as the silver pin on her blazer. "We appreciate your attendance," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But you'll have to file all complaints in writing. Personal matters can't be discussed during open meetings." When Emily tried to explain the harassment, Carol interrupted. Not once, but 3 times. Reminding her that rules exist for a reason. When I asked what rule allowed someone to take photos through her fence, Carol's smile finally cracked. "If she has nothing to hide," she said, "she shouldn't be concerned." That's when I knew this was deliberate. And if they wanted to play by their rules, I'd start learning those rules, every single one. Over the next few weeks, I dug into Maplewood's HOA bylaws. 68 pages of fine print and contradictions, most of them outdated or self-contradictory. They had power, but it wasn't absolute. And buried in those pages was something they probably didn't expect anyone to read. The right to due process clause. It required the HOA to document every violation with time, stamped proof, photos, witnesses, or board-approved inspections. And guess what? Not one of Emily's fines included any evidence. So we started collecting our own. Every notice, every letter, every envelope. I even set up a camera near her porch, just a small motion-activated unit tucked behind a flower pot. Within a week, it captured exactly what I suspected: Carol herself walking onto the property after dark, snapping photos, and leaving another violation notice before hurrying off. When I showed the footage to Emily, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The proof was right there, but confronting them too soon could backfire. So we waited. That patience paid off when the HOA took it one step further. Emily received a certified letter claiming she owed over $3 in Zallows and in unpaid assessments and penalties. They warned that if she didn't pay within 30 days, the HOA would place a lion on her home. That's when something inside me snapped. I wasn't just angry. I was focused. They wanted a fight, and now they were going to get one. I contacted a local real estate attorney who specialized in HOA abuse cases. The first thing he did was laugh. Not because it was funny, but because he'd seen this story before. Power-hungry boards preying on the vulnerable. Same pattern, different zip code. He helped us draft a formal demand for evidence of all alleged violations. The letter cited specific bylaw clauses and warned of potential civil liability if they failed to comply. We mailed it certified, signature required. A week passed, then two. Silence. Until one morning, Emily opened her mailbox and found a thick envelope marked HOA Records Response. Inside were half a dozen blurry photos, none showing any violations, and a typed statement saying, "This matter is closed." They thought that was the end of it. But I had other plans. We uploaded the camera footage, printed out their bogus notices, and sent everything to the County Housing Commission and the state's HOA Oversight Board. The attorney filed a formal complaint citing harassment, retaliation, and procedural misconduct. Still, I knew the HOA wouldn't take this quietly, and sure enough, the retaliation came fast. Her trash pickup suddenly stopped. For 3 weeks, the landscaping crew skipped her yard entirely, and one night, someone slashed her car tire right in her driveway. No witnesses, no cameras on that side of the house. Just a note tucked under the windshield that said, "Maybe you should move." That's when Emily finally broke. She wanted to sell the house, leave everything behind, just disappear. But the thought of letting them win, of letting them do this to someone else, kept me from agreeing. I told her, if we walk away now, they'll just find another target. So we held our ground. The next HOA meeting was packed. More people than usual. Word had gotten out that something was going on. I stayed in the back while Emily stood near the front, holding a folder of every fine, every notice, every unanswered appeal. When Carol tried to skip over her on the agenda, Emily didn't budge. "I have the floor," she said quietly. And for the first time, the room went silent. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply told her story. How they'd harassed her for months, how they ignored every request for proof, how they'd even trespassed onto her property. Then I stepped forward with the footage. The screen lit up with the image of Carol sneaking around the property at night. The room gasped. Carol's face went pale. She tried to claim it was routine inspection. But the timestamp, nearly midnight, made that lie collapse in seconds. That moment was electric. But it wasn't victory yet. Because the board immediately recessed, refusing to discuss it, pending review. They packed up, avoided eye contact, and left the room in chaos. We thought maybe they'd back off after being exposed. But within days, things got worse. A notice arrived claiming her house was now under mandatory compliance audit. They demanded access to inspect the inside of her home. Something completely outside their legal authority. When she refused, they fined her again. It was clear now, they were desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. And they were about to make their biggest one yet. Late one evening, as I was reviewing the documents for the complaint, I noticed something strange in the HOA's budget summary. A line item labeled Special Administrative Fees. Thousands of dollars that didn't match any legitimate expense. I cross-referenced it with public filings and realized what was happening. The board had been funneling HOA dues into a private account. The harassment wasn't just personal. It was a smokescreen. They were trying to intimidate homeowners, to distract from their own corruption. That discovery changed everything. We handed the evidence over to the attorney, who immediately contacted the state investigator already reviewing our complaint. Within days, an inquiry was launched into the HOA's financial records. And just like that, the same board that had acted untouchable suddenly went silent. No calls, no notices, no visits. The neighborhood, once buzzing with gossip, grew eerily quiet. Emily could finally breathe again. But we both knew this calm wasn't peace. It was the pause before the storm. Because when people like that realize they're cornered, they don't surrender. They strike back. And the next move they made would turn the entire neighborhood against them. And finally bring everything crashing down. The morning the investigation became public, Maplewood Estates didn't wake up to its usual calm. Instead, every doorstep carried the same thing. A letter from the state's Office of Community Oversight, announcing a formal audit of the HOA's finances and management practices. By noon, the neighborhood message boards were exploding. Homeowners who had stayed silent for years suddenly remembered their own strange fines and unanswered complaints. For once, it wasn't Emily against the HOA. It was the community. The people they'd silenced. Finally turning to face the ones who ruled them. But Carol and her board weren't going down quietly. That evening, they called an emergency HOA meeting. Every resident received a notice urging attendance to discuss false accusations and restore community integrity. It was a desperate move. A last attempt to rewrite the narrative before the truth fully unraveled. I told Emily we didn't have to go. But she looked at me, calm and certain. They started this in front of everyone, she said. They're going to end it the same way. The meeting hall was packed. Folding chairs filled the room, neighbors pressed against the walls. Whispers running like static through the crowd. At the front, Carol sat beneath the fluorescent lights, her usual confidence replaced with a brittle smile. Stacks of papers sat neatly in front of her. A performance of control. When she called the meeting to order, she didn't waste time. There have been serious accusations made against this board. She began, voice sharp, eyes scanning the crowd. I want to be clear. These claims are baseless, malicious, and intended to divide our community. The murmurs grew louder. Someone shouted from the back. Then why's the state here? Because right behind us, two men in suits, auditors, were quietly setting up a table, pulling out files and microphones. The tension snapped like a wire. Carol tried to continue, her voice trembling slightly. We have always acted in the best interest of Maplewood. That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I's trespassing in a pregnant woman's yard part of the HOA's best interest. The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward me. Carol froze, her knuckles whitening around her stack of papers. I walked forward slowly, placing a folder on the table. The same folder Emily had held weeks ago. You remember this, I said. The violation notices, the fines, the false reports. But tonight, we're adding one more thing. I nodded to the auditor, who connected a small speaker. Then came the sound. The audio from a recorded phone call between two board members, one of whom had decided to cooperate with the investigation. Carol's voice was unmistakable, cold, clipped, confident. Make her life miserable. She'll sell eventually. We can list the property before the market shifts. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A neighbor in the front row whispered, "She said that." Carol's composure shattered. She stood abruptly, face pale. That recording is taken out of context. But the auditor cut in. It's part of an ongoing investigation, Mrs. Hensley. We advise you to remain seated. For once, Carol didn't have control of the room. The auditors began reading from their findings. Unapproved fees, missing funds, fake maintenance charges funneled into a personal account. The same account Carol used to pay off her private landscaping company. Every revelation landed like a hammer. Homeowners who had once nodded politely at board meetings now shouted, demanding answers. Someone yelled, "You fined me for my roof. And you were stealing our money." Another slammed a chair leg against the floor, the sound echoing through the hall. I looked at Emily. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. The same people who had looked away when she was being harassed were now standing beside her, furious. Carol tried one last move. Denial through deflection. "These documents are confidential," she snapped. "You can't just parade them around." But the auditor calmly held up an official letter. "You no longer have that authority, ma'am." That's when the state investigator stepped forward, badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Carol Hensley, you're being served with an injunction pending further review of financial misconduct and harassment allegations." The room erupted. People shouted, others clapped, and somewhere in the noise, Carol slumped back into her chair. Defeated, eyes wide, as if the walls she'd built for years had finally caved in. But it wasn't over yet. The rest of the board members tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance. "We didn't know," one muttered. Another said, "We were just following her lead." But the auditors had receipts. Literally. Every transfer, every signature. They were all complicit. By the time the investigators finished, the once feared HOA board looked like a row of ghosts. Silent, drained, stripped of power. The irony wasn't lost on anyone for years. They'd ruled by intimidation and paperwork. Now paperwork was exactly what took them down. When the meeting ended, no one rushed to leave. People lingered in small groups, buzzing with disbelief and anger. Some came up to Emily, apologizing for staying quiet before. She didn't gloat, she didn't need to. As we stepped outside, the cool air felt different, lighter somehow. The houses looked the same, but the neighborhood had changed. The illusion of control was gone. For the first time in months, Emily smiled. Not the polite, tired smile she used to give when pretending everything was fine, but a real one. "I guess justice really does knock," she said quietly. But even as we walked to the car, headlights flashed behind us. A dark SUV idled at the curb. Carol's, unmistakable. She sat behind the wheel, staring at us through the glass. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, the window rolled down. "You think this is over," she said, voice barely audible over the wind. "You ruined everything." I met her gaze, calm and steady. "No," I said. "You did that all by yourself." She didn't reply. The window rolled up. The engine roared, and the SUV disappeared down the road, taillights fading into the dark. It should have felt like victory. And part of it did. But as we watched her vanish into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't finished. Because when people like Carol lose their power, they don't just disappear. They look for someone to blame. And the next morning, we'd find out exactly how far she was willing to go to take back control. The morning after the board's dramatic fall, Maplewood Estates was quiet in a way it hadn't been for months. Almost eerily so. Neighbors peeked out their windows, speaking in hushed tones, as if the walls themselves might carry their words to the wrong ears. The neighborhood looked the same. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, the same winding streets. But the tension that had hung like a storm cloud was gone. For the first time in over a year, Emily and I could breathe without watching over our shoulders. The state investigators wasted no time. Within days, they completed a thorough audit of the HOA's finances. The results were staggering. Thousands of dollars had been diverted into private accounts, misreported as maintenance costs or administrative fees. The funds, which rightfully belonged to the homeowners, were traced to personal accounts linked to Carol and two of her closest board allies. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was fraud. Carol tried to defend herself publicly, releasing statements that painted her as a victim of malicious rumors and personal attacks. But the evidence was overwhelming. The photos, recordings, and invoices we had painstakingly collected over months left no room for doubt. State authorities revoked the board's powers and froze their access to HOA accounts immediately. For Emily, the relief was tangible but cautious. Her first priority was the baby. A little girl due any day. The constant harassment had taken a toll on her health and sleep. But now, she could finally focus on preparing for motherhood without the looming fear of fines or surprise inspections. The yard she had been harassed over for months was no longer a battlefield. She could plant flowers, hang wind chimes, and decorate the porch freely. The house became her sanctuary rather than a trap. The neighborhood itself began to shift. Homeowners, once quiet and compliant, found their voices again. Small meetings cropped up, not just to discuss aesthetics or bylaws, but to reclaim a sense of community that had been eroded over time. People shared their own stories of harassment, strange fines, threats, and invasive inspections, and realized that Emily had only been one of many targets. For the first time, victims weren't alone, and that collective awareness created a sense of unity that had been absent for years. The state investigators' involvement led to more than just financial consequences. Carol and her allies were required to attend mandatory hearings, and some faced civil suits from the very residents they had tried to control. Their reputations were permanently damaged. In meetings where they had once commanded the room with a condescending smile, they now sat quietly, avoiding eye contact, and listening to homeowners recount the abuses of power that had flourished unchecked for years. It was a reversal almost poetic in its justice. The same control tactics they had wielded now reflected back on them in full. For Emily and me, there were smaller victories too. We negotiated a partial reimbursement of the fines they had wrongly imposed, which, while symbolic, carried enormous emotional weight. It wasn't just the money. It was validation. It was proof that we hadn't been imagining the harassment, that the endless struggle wasn't a battle fought in vain. The changes to the HOA's structure were immediate and sweeping. New board members were elected, outsiders with no prior ties to the previous leadership. Clear, transparent rules were put into place, emphasizing fairness, accountability, and due process. Homeowners were encouraged to actively participate, and mechanisms were introduced to prevent the rise of a power-hungry clique. Maplewood Estates, once a microcosm of bureaucracy and control, began to resemble a real community again. People smiled as they passed one another. Conversations weren't whispered anymore. Even the mailman commented that the atmosphere felt different, lighter, almost like the neighborhood had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Despite the legal and structural victories, some things couldn't be fixed immediately. The emotional toll on Emily was deep. Nights of anxiety, months of stress, and constant fear had left their mark. But slowly, she began to reclaim herself. We spent evenings sitting on the porch, talking about everything except the HOA. She planted flowers without worrying about fines. She walked through the neighborhood without scanning the shadows. And finally, when our daughter was born, the sense of triumph crystallized. Not just because we had exposed the corruption, but because Emily had survived it, unbroken. The birth itself became a symbol of resilience. The same neighborhood that had once treated her as a target now celebrated the arrival of a new life. Gifts appeared on doorsteps, neighbors offered meals, and even those who had been silent before approached with congratulations. It was a subtle but profound reminder. Fear had no permanent hold over a community that chose to stand together. On a personal level, the experience changed me too. Watching someone I cared for endure months of harassment, and then taking steps to confront systemic abuse, transformed my perspective on power and accountability. It wasn't enough to be angry or frustrated. Action was necessary. Evidence had to be collected meticulously, allies needed to be engaged strategically, and patience had to be balanced with determination. The fight wasn't just about Emily or the fines. It was about proving that ordinary people could hold institutions accountable when those institutions abused their authority. The HOA ordeal also sent ripples beyond our street. Other neighborhoods began auditing their own boards, questioning long-standing practices, and demanding transparency. Emily and I were contacted by residents in nearby communities, asking how we documented evidence, how we approached legal counsel, and how we maintained our resolve under stress. Our story, while intensely personal, became a guide, a roadmap for standing up to systems designed to intimidate and control. And yet, not every victory was neat or clean. Some neighbors still clung to fear, wary of drawing attention. Some board members quietly left town rather than face public scrutiny. And, of course, there was the subtle tension that the same type of personality could always emerge in another guise. The struggle for accountability was ongoing, a reminder that vigilance was necessary, even after apparent resolution. But the greatest lesson came in reflection. The HOA had tried to strip Emily of autonomy, dignity, and peace of mind, yet in their overreach, they revealed their own corruption and vulnerability. The system, they thought, was untouchable. And yet, exposure, truth, and community action dismantled their illusion of power. It was a lesson, not just in persistence, but in moral clarity. Those who manipulate fear often underestimate the resilience of ordinary people. As we walked through the neighborhood weeks later, Emily holding our newborn, I noticed subtle shifts in how neighbors interacted. Conversations were more open, more supportive. Children played without fear of some arbitrary rule being enforced. Even the landscaping looked different. no longer pristine in a sterile way, but vibrant, alive, and reflecting the individuality of the homeowners. The environment itself had become a testament to resistance against petty tyranny. In one particularly striking moment, I overheard a group of longtime residents speaking about the change. One woman said, "I've lived here 20 years, but I've never felt like this is our neighborhood. Now, finally, it is." That simple acknowledgement was worth more than any legal victory. It was evidence that the battle we fought wasn't only about fines or violations. It was about reclaiming dignity, community, and trust. Emily and I also made the decision to document everything, not in a public or sensational way, but as a record of resilience. Photos of letters, recordings, receipts, and timelines formed a comprehensive archive of the ordeal. It became our personal chronicle, a reminder of what had been endured, what had been achieved, and what vigilance might be required in the future. Months later, as the HOA continued under new leadership, Emily started an informal support group for residents who had faced harassment. A place to share experiences, provide guidance, and reinforce community solidarity. The group became a small but growing movement, a practical expression of empowerment rooted in lived experience. Looking back, the experience highlighted a stark truth: petty power often relies on isolation, fear, and silence. Once those are broken, the same force that once oppressed can be held accountable, and the community, not just a single individual, becomes the agent of justice. Our final reflection on the ordeal came one evening, while sitting on the porch, baby asleep inside. Emily leaned back, exhaling slowly. "It wasn't just about fighting them," she said quietly. "It was about not letting fear dictate our lives." And in that moment, I realized she was right. The HOA could fine, threaten, and intimidate, but they couldn't take our agency, our resolve, or the life we were building. They had underestimated the strength that comes from standing up together, with evidence, with patience, and with conviction. As the sun set over Maplewood Estates, painting the streets in gold, a final thought lingered: systems of control may rise, but when faced with courage, truth, and solidarity, they fall. And perhaps the most powerful takeaway is this: real justice isn't always swift or easy, but it is possible, even against the most entrenched forms of petty tyranny. So the question remains, not just for us, but for anyone watching: how long will you let fear and arbitrary power dictate your life before you decide to take a stand? Because standing up is never easy, but it is always necessary. And in that quiet, golden light, Maplewood finally felt free.